Right. It's a real pleasure to be kicking off the summit again this year. Thank you to Lori and Pollinator Friendly Alliance for inviting me to present. My name's Heather Holm. I am a pollinator conservationist and author of several books. And I look forward to talking to you about a fairly new topic, a new presentation, this idea of a soft landing. So we'll get right into it so we stay on time. So to start off, of course, as Lori said, we have a lot of work to do, but we all can play an important role, whether it's putting little mini ecosystems within our gardens or yards, or in our local parks, or working on larger ecological restorations. And all of that is sort of bounded by the idea that these diverse native plant ecosystems are more functional and more resilient to stressors such as climate change or any kind of negative disturbance. So that is the fundamental principle of why we highly promote native plants and biodiversity when we're thinking of pollinator habitat. And we can think of whether it's a small garden ecosystem or a large natural area. These ecosystems are based upon a lot of different interactions of basically what eats what in the food web. So this is a basic graphic or illustration of the plants, the foundation, the plant-eating organisms, the herbivores, the omnivores on top of that, and lastly, the carnivores. So this food web consists of these multiple trophic levels. And most importantly, based on our topics today for this conference, we'll be looking at those two foundational layers. So the native plants, the diversity of native plants, and then the insects that have these co-evolved relationships with native plants. And many insects have very much specialized relationships with native plants, a specialized diet. So the monarch butterfly and the monarch caterpillars and the milkweed association is not unique. Many different insect groups have specialist relationships with native plants. In fact, wasps, some of you may know I wrote a book on flower visiting predatory wasps, and even predatory wasps have very specific prey that they hunt to feed their offspring. So it's not just certain groups in the insect world, it's most insects have these specialist relationships. And if we take a deeper dive into some of these insect groups, looking at butterfly and moth caterpillars, also called lepidopteran larvae, much of the research by Doug Tallamy, Desiree Narango, Kimberly Shropshire, they have looked at historical data of what are the larval host plants or the plants that these caterpillars eat. And they tie this into the importance of ecosystems because 96% of terrestrial songbirds are feeding their offspring, their chicks, some kind of lepidopteran larvae or butterfly or moth caterpillar. And through their research, what they found that not all native plants are created equal in their ability or to be a larval host plant. So only certain native plants are really are the workhorses within an ecosystem. So this graphic designed by Elsa Cousins was commissioned by these researchers. And I'll just walk you through the 4-panel graphic, reiterating what I just talked about. These functional food webs are essential for the successful conservation of ecological communities. And as they looked at historical data, they found that the majority of insect herbivores, such as caterpillars, are specialized to feed on just one or a few larval host plants. But when they looked at these larval host plants, specifically tree genera, they found that only 14% of the tree genera were larval host plants for 90% of the caterpillar species. So this is really significant. We can have a diversity of different tree genera growing in our garden or in a natural area, but some are really, you can picture them having a bird feeder that is full of bird seed, or a bird feeder that has very little seed being offered to birds. So there's a significant difference in the biomass that these different plant genera are providing in the form of herbivores, and specifically caterpillars. So they coined these specific tree genera that are really significant larval host plants for different caterpillars as keystone plants. So you can think of them as being the primary hubs or nodes that are servicing many different interactions between the consumers, the organisms that are plant feeding, and if you compare that with a tree genus that is maybe a larval host plant for just a handful of caterpillars, you wouldn't envision that it is a hub or node having all of these many different interactions that a keystone tree genera would have. And so then they looked across the US at the county level, and they found a consistent pattern where the top 5 tree genera generally across the US, and likely this is the case in Canada as well, include oak, willows, the cherry and plum, the prunus genus, pines, poplar, aspen, apple, and maple. So what does this mean if we are looking at our garden as a little mini ecosystem? Well, it means if we do have one of these keystone tree genera, we have a really unique opportunity. And the last graphic that they commissioned here just reinforces that if we don't have keystone tree genera within an ecosystem or landscape, we're failing really to provide the significant biomass in the form of caterpillars that is critical for even the chickadee, who needs to capture anywhere from 9,000 to 16,000 caterpillars just to rear one nest of offspring. So if we don't have these keystone tree genera, they claim that the ecosystem would collapse in a similar way that if you remove that keystone from a Roman arch, then the arch itself or the structure would collapse. So we can look at this as an opportunity. I'll just highlight 3 of the keystone tree genera, but I encourage you to investigate more which are the top 5 within the region that you live, and I'll have links and resources at the end of the presentation. But kicking off with oaks across the continent fall in usually in the top 3 tree genera for keystone trees. And they are, we have a large diversity of different oak trees. Across the United States alone, oaks collectively support close to 940 species of caterpillars. So that is just really outstanding. Plums and the cherries, I'm highlighting the plums because I think of them as being a really interesting early spring pollinator, pollen and nectar source. But then in addition, they are a significant larval host plant to numerous number of caterpillars. And lastly, and again, there are many more keystone tree genera, but I'm just highlighting a few. Lastly, pines. So pines across the eastern US are ubiquitous. Prior to Euro-American settlement, the pines and oaks were 2 dominant tree genera, and they thrive in fire-maintained systems. So that picture on the right is of a Florida longleaf pine savanna, and on the left, a soft landings plantings by Diane under a white pine tree. So if you have any of these keystone tree genera within a landscape that you're managing, stay tuned because I'm going to give you some ideas of what to do about that. So I'm going to oscillate a little bit back and forth. So we just talked about keystone plants for caterpillars, and now we're going to take a look at keystone plants as it relates to native bees. So I'm sort of switching back and forth here, so stay with me. So many of our native bee species do specialize on collecting a narrow range of pollens, and this is sort of some estimates across the central and eastern US. I apologize for our western US attendees, but you can check out Jared Fowler's website at the link below to look up the statistics for your Western state. But as you can see, specialists range from anywhere from 18% to over 45% within the number of species that occur within a state. And specialists and the specialization of these native bees really is across a range. And I'll just go through a few categories. Most bees have not been assigned a very strict sort of category of specialization because there's still much to learn about these bees that specialize on certain pollen. But I'll just give you a few examples. So this would be a possible example of a bee called a narrow oligolectic bee. And this is a female mining bee that she specializes on collecting pollen from a single plant genus. And in this case, it's in the geranium genus. And this bee occurs across the upper Midwest and in the Northeast. And the next category, which is a little less specialized, would be an oligolectic bee. And as you can see from the graphic, bees in this category specialize on collecting pollen from a few related plant genera. So the example I have here is another species of mining bee, and the females for this species collect pollen from Rudbeckia and Ratibida plant genera. So another example of an oligolectic bee, which we have numerous ones, are ones that are active in late summer and autumn, and they specialize on collecting pollen from both goldenrods and asters, two plant genera that are very closely related, belonging to the same plant family. Last category I'll just touch on, it's an unusual one, bees that are considered eclectic oligolectics. And as you can see, they collect pollen from two completely unrelated plant genera belonging to two different plant families. So the example I have here is the southern blueberry bee. This bee occurs from Florida all the way up to Maine in the eastern US. And as you can see, the females specialize on collecting vaccinium or blueberry pollen in addition to in some cases, and this is regionally, there's differences in the region of where these plants occur. The females may also collect pollen from redbud as well as lupin belonging to the pea family. So that is a really unusual category for these pollen specialist bees. And just quickly looking at this from the perspective of keystone plants. So this is the eastern US, so from Maine down to Florida, west to Illinois, for example, that swath of the eastern US. These are the top plant genera. These are all herbaceous plants that can be considered keystone plants or keystone pollen host plants for these specialist bees. And as you can see, some close to the top 8 or top 9 on this list, the goldenrods, the asters, black-eyed Susans, etc., belong to the aster family. So you can see that the top for the eastern US is goldenrods. 39 different bee specialists specialize on collecting goldenrod pollen. For the central US, a similar trend, although sunflowers in the Helianthus genus are top, providing 101 different bee species, their pollen host plant source. And lastly, in the western US, we also have a similar trend, and you can see much higher numbers of bee specialists that occur in the West. And that is because bee diversity generally increases from low numbers in the Northeast across the continent and high numbers in the Southwest. So the Western US has the most species of pollen specialist bees. All right, so if we take these concepts of keystone trees for larval host plants for caterpillars, and then these herbaceous plants for pollen specialist bees, we can package this all together into a really unique mini ecosystem design. But first, let's take a look back at the caterpillars. So this is a red-spotted caterpillar feeding on a black cherry leaf, and a black cherry is in the Prunus genus, so it's a keystone plant. And when this caterpillar is ready to pupate, it actually sort of webs itself with silken threads into a rolled leaf, which then drops to the ground. Now, this is not the case for all caterpillars feeding on a keystone plant. Some will prepare for pupation by remaining on the host plant, but a certain percentage of caterpillars typically disperse from their host plant to find a safe place to spend the next stage of their life cycle, the pupal, and then emerging into an adult. So my friend Leslie Pilgrim, who has a nonprofit called Neighborhood Greening, she said to me one day, Doug Tallamy, in all of his lectures nationwide talking about keystone plants, hasn't been talking about what happens to these caterpillars when they're ready to pupate. And so she came up with this idea that there needs to be a safe place under the keystone trees. And you guys can laugh at my silly graphic here of caterpillars falling from the tree. But to bring home this concept that if we have compacted soil and turf grass under a keystone tree, we're not providing viable habitat for these caterpillars to complete their next life cycle stage. And so Leslie came up with this concept of a soft landing, and I just love it. It's really resonated with a lot of people, and it quickly sort of gives you this visual of what a soft landing could be. So this is a really nice example that Lane shared his photos with me, the University of Illinois campus. They've been converting underutilized turf grass spaces on the campus to these soft landing-like plantings. And we envision that these soft landings, of course, would be low-growing plants with soft textures, but most importantly, they're going to be providing that critical habitat and refuge, not only for those caterpillars that may be dispersing from their host plant, but in addition for different beneficial insects that need safe refuge to spend some part of their life cycle stage as well. And the benefit of doing these plantings under a tree is that we can creatively include flowering plants that bloom throughout the growing season, also flowering plants that could be supporting pollen specialist bees, other plants that may be in addition larval host plants for various caterpillars. So the opportunities are sort of endless in how we can reinforce providing these mini ecosystems to support the life cycle stages of not just bees, but other beneficial insects. And those beneficial insects include things such as lacewings, ladybird beetles, fireflies, and syrphid flies that may overwinter under the leaf litter or sometimes in the soil underground. So let's take a quick look at a couple of those beneficial insects. Ladybird beetles, sometimes people call them ladybugs. They are a true beetle, and we have numerous species. Both the larvae and adults are predatory on various soft-bodied insects, and the adults generally overwinter under leaf litter. So having a soft landings planting with a dense vegetative planting as well as leaf litter would provide refuge for ladybird beetles. Similarly, beneficial insects such as these soldier beetles, the larvae are caterpillar-like and predatory, consuming a wide range of different pest insect eggs and pest insects. And the larvae overwinter in the soil or in the leaf litter. And the adults that you may find in late summer are heavy flower visitors, do some pollination. They're heavy consumers of flower pollen and nectar. Lastly, just to highlight a third beneficial insect, the syrphid flies. Syrphid flies have various sort of larval habitat. Some are aquatic, but this particular subfamily, they do overwinter in leaf litter or in the soil. And you can see the females are attracted to flowering plants to consume pollen and nectar. And then while they are within that habitat, they will lay their eggs on plants that have some type of pest insect that their larvae consume. So their larvae look caterpillar-like, but they are also voracious predators of soft-bodied insects. Those two images show them consuming aphids, for example. All right, back to the soft landings. So how do we create a soft landings planting? We can start by using a matrix of either low-growing sedges or low-growing grasses, and then plugging the flowering plants within that matrix. So let's take a look at some of these plants. So if we start with a matrix of sedges. Now sedges, most of the sedges belong to the genus Carex. They are grass-like plants that are cool season plants, meaning that they do most of their growth during the shoulder seasons in early spring and in autumn. And some of them are evergreen, so they actually stay green even under the snow here in Minnesota. So they are wonderful to look at when the snow melts. You have something green growing in your garden. One of the most common species across the central and eastern US is Pennsylvania sedge. Some sedges are clump forming, others are rhizomatous. This is a rhizomatous species. It's been used with great effect as an alternative lawn. These are photos that Dustin Demner shared with me. He has a native plant nursery here in Minnesota, Blazing Star Gardens. So Pennsylvania sedge can be a nice soft lawn alternative for partial shaded areas. He's also used it along pathway borders in some of his designs, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It's kind of soft textured mounding. We also have clump forming sedges. This is the eastern star sedge on the left, Carex radiata. Sprangle sedge, which is a little bit taller, very attractive sedge and clump forming. And ivory sedge, I like to call this the mop top sedge, very fine bladed sedge, really interesting texture. Another one of Dustin's designs, he's included it again on a pathway border, and then on the right in a soft landings like planting. So it's a really fun sedge, short and low growing. Some other examples that Dustin shared on the left is the same planting as the right, and this is Plains oval or prairie sedge, a rather more upright sedge, really interesting seed heads. So the photo on the left is earlier in the planting and when it was more mature on the right, and this is at a school in central Minnesota. And here is a list of some additional sedges. So I encourage you to look at all of the different species. Now, just to keep in mind, many of the native sedges thrive in wetland and wet soils, so they would not be appropriate for this application. But there is a sort of a minority of sedges that are considered upland, woodland, or partial shade thriving sedges. So don't just grab a sedge from the nursery and think it may work. Make sure you do your homework. But here is a quick list for some of the regions to give you some additional ideas of the sedges that you can incorporate in a soft landings planting. You could also consider some cool season grasses. So sort of the same growth strategy as sedges. These grasses usually do all of their growth and flowering in spring, and then they sort of come to life again when the temperatures cool in autumn. Plants in the genus Elamis as well as Bromus are two common cool season grass plant genera. The cool season grasses tend to be taller, so I would suggest that you could use something like this bottle brush grass as an accent within your soft landings planting. But generally the idea we had behind soft landings plantings is to keep most of the plants fairly low growing. And this is really for the aesthetics and the acceptability of putting a planting like this, perhaps in a front yard, to make it more acceptable looking to your neighbors. All right, so we've got that matrix of sedges, cool season grasses, and you can also include warm season grasses depending on your light levels. But now we want to start thinking about having a continuous succession of flowering plants through the growing season, and that includes some of the really early blooming species such as Dutchman's breeches, which tends to provide early nectar sources for some of our early emerging spring bumblebee species. Common blue violet is another idea. We have so many different native violets to choose from. So these are just suggestions. Please check out some of the options within the area you live. Bloodroot, another early blooming woodland plant that is nectarless and provides pollen for some of the bees that are active in early spring. Jacob's ladder actually supports a single pollen specialist bees pictured there. So you can provide pollen for various types of bees as well as possibly the specialist if it occurs within your area. This is a nice picture of one of Dustin's soft landing plantings. He has both Jacob's ladder in the bottom right as well as woodland phlox incorporated for beautiful lavender spring bloom. And you can still see that sedge and grass matrix that's in between these flowering plants. Wild geranium, one of my favorites. It does well in both shade, partial sun, and somewhat full sun conditions. It has, as I mentioned earlier, one pollen specialist, a type of mining bee. Similarly, the water leaves, this is the Virginia water leaf. We have other water leaf species in the US, and there is a single pollen specialist of water leaf. I have this specialist in my home garden. So this is one that if the specialist is regionally occurs, you have the possibility of attracting it by planting something like Virginia water leaf in a soft landings planting. Looking at different textures within the soft landings planting. So we have the grass-like textures from the sedges and grasses, the flowering plant foliage, and then we can start to consider adding in some different ferns. This is a photo Vicki Bonk submitted. She's got her boulevard planting with maidenhair fern in the foreground, and then her soft landings planting in the background, which includes lady fern. I like to think of using ferns for some of those flowering plant species that are truly ephemeral, the ones that go dormant after blooming. So the things such as Dutchman's breeches or Virginia bluebells, for example, you can interplant ferns next to those flowering plants so they fill the void once those plants go dormant after blooming in spring. Bellwort, the plants in the genus Uvularia, provide pollen and nectar resources for bumblebees, mining bees, small sweat bees, and they also there is one pollen specialist of Uvularia here in the Midwest, a type of mining bee. Virginia bluebells, which I just mentioned, long tubular flowers. The bumblebees really like Virginia bluebells, but that is a plant that will go completely dormant. So make sure you have something to plant to fill that void after it goes dormant. The early spring forest plants such as trout lily in the genus Erythronium, as well as spring beauty, also have one pollen specialist, both featured here on this slide. So if you have more shaded conditions, these would be really nice early spring blooming plants to incorporate in a soft landings planting. The wild blue phlox that I featured earlier in Dustin's planting with those long tubular flowers. You generally don't see any native bees successfully extracting the pollen or nectar resources from phlox simply because of that flower structure. That long tubular flower tends to serve our long-tongued insects such as butterflies and moths, but still an important plant. And it also is, I believe it's stoloniferous, so it'll sort of spread and weave through the low-growing sedges that you have in your soft landings planting. False Solomon seal as well as true Solomon seal are really nice arching spring blooming plants that would be appropriate for a soft landings planting. Here's a picture Michelle submitted. She lives in Pennsylvania, and she has a soft landings planting under this large oak tree in her front yard. She's incorporated white violets, foam flower in the genus Tiarella, as well as Eastern Columbine. I like this example because she didn't necessarily, excuse me, fill it up with sedges and grasses, but I think she's done a really nice job just using flowering herbaceous plants in the soft landings planting. Getting into later spring, the golds. So if you're in the Midwest or Northeast, this is one of my favorite carrot family plants, Golden Alexander. And there's a single pollen specialist of that, the Andrena ziziae. If you're in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, these are some gold options for you in spring. Golden ragwort, the Pacra, which there is a pollen specialist for that, as well as green and gold, which is a stoloniferous plant that will spread through your soft landings planting. Two really, really nice examples. All right, later in spring, so now we're into late May, June, and plants in the genus Heuchera, including the American alum root if you're in the eastern US, the prairie alum root if you're in the Midwest. Have two different pollen specialists. This is one, the Caletes andrewsii on the prairie alum root. But I think the American alum root particularly has those really interesting leaves or foliage with the silver markings. So that's a really nice, another sort of foliage to highlight within a soft landings planting. The milkweeds. So now we're getting into summer, and we do have some more shade tolerant milkweeds. I'm just highlighting poke milkweed, one of my favorite milkweeds. And it is still a larval host plant for the monarch caterpillar, has more loose, sort of firework-like flowers, and it gets anywhere from 18 to 24 inches tall. So you could use something like this as an accent plant within a soft landings planting. If you have heavy deer pressure, like I do in the suburbs here of the Twin Cities, you could try some plants in the mint family, such as the wood mints, the Blophelias, because the deer and the rabbits will not eat them. And they provide nice pollen and nectar sources midsummer for various native bee species. And then bookending the season, we can't forget about the goldenrods, and I'll feature the asters after this. But as you saw with the pollen host plant, Keystone plants, they are heavy hitters. And they are also significant larval host plants. So they're sort of a twofer. They're Keystone plants for both pollen specialist bees as well as caterpillars. I thought I would just feature some that are more shade tolerant and well behaved, but please, consider sun-loving, clump-forming goldenrods if your soft landings planting has higher light levels. But these tend to grow in woodlands and savannas, including the zigzag goldenrod here, which is a slow-spreading rhizomatous goldenrod species, one of my favorites. The elm leaf goldenrod, which grows in our Midwestern open oak woodlands and savannas, very attractive goldenrod. Blue stem goldenrod, if you're east of the Midwest and in the Northeast, very attractive plant that has quite amount of shade tolerance. So you can think about incorporating that into a soft landings planting. And of course, we have so many different native bees that specialize on either just goldenrod or goldenrod and aster pollen. And I would love to spend another hour showing you all of them, but Lori would cut me off. So here are two of my favorite, the hairy-banded mining bee and the spine-shouldered cellophane bee. And lastly, the asters. So we have so many different asters native to North America. But the ones, again, I'm featuring here would be ones that have some shade tolerance and would be more woodland asters. So the blue wood aster featured on the photo the whitewood aster. So the plants in the genus Eurybia tend to be more woodland asters, but we do have some Symphyotrichums that also have some shade tolerance. This is the large-leaved aster, Eurybia macrophylla. It's a Midwestern species. Example of how Dustin has used it in a planting. It's a spreading, low-growing spreading aster, and it tends to be one that the rabbits and deer don't readily consume for the reason I don't know, but this is one reason I like to plant it in my plantings. Crooked stem aster is a really interesting aster with a fair amount of shade tolerance, as well as smooth blue aster. But again, take a look at all of the different asters that are native to your area and find the ones that would meet the conditions within your soft landings planting. And similarly, so many different pollen specialist bees of asters and or goldenrods. Here are a few. And again, I'd love to show you more, but I'm trying to stay on time. All right, so planting your soft landings planting. So if you're starting with turfgrass conversion, we highly recommend avoiding using herbicides to spray out that turfgrass, simply because you're applying herbicides right to that tree root system. So the one method would be smothering or sheet mulching using paper, and then one layer of mulch to weigh down that paper. The paper that I've used in the past in my home landscape when I was doing conversion is called painter's paper. It's available in paint stores or home improvement stores. It comes in a roll. So you can roll it out, overlap it, cut it with a box cutter, and then add mulch on top. With the concern with bulk mulch having invasive jumping worms, the research at the University of Minnesota has shown that if you do buy bagged mulch, you can leave it out in the sun on your driveway for a couple of days to let it heat up, and that will ensure that you're killing any jumping worms that may be within the bag mulch. The plastic bags, yes, that it does create plastic waste, but there are opportunities to wash those bags and to recycle that plastic waste. Okay, the other option is, and some people have utilized this, is just to pile a thick layer of mulch instead of using the paper on the planting area. But please use your own judgment of what would be potentially impactful to the tree or not. And so we are planting a soft landings planting within the root system of a tree. So we have to be very careful that we don't impact the health of the tree. So we highly recommend that you buy deep plugs. So there's a photo of a deep plug that is grown by Blazing Star Gardens. So these tend to be sort of cell pack, but deeper. And planting densely. And planting densely and buying these smaller plants is generally more economical. And then your planting will fill in quite quickly, so you will have less weed pressure by doing so. So here is a photo of one of Dustin's plantings. You can see he's mulched and prepped the area. He's just plugged in these deep cell pack plugs, planting anywhere from 6 to 8 inches on center, mixing those grass-like sedges with the flowering plants. And fast forward a year or two, and the planting has filled in and has very little weed pressure because of that dense vegetative cover. So again, you don't want to get out your long-handled shovel and start digging 1 and 2 gallon holes in the root system of your tree. So try and source these smaller, deep cell pack size plants. Stay away from the tree trunk and those primary roots. So if you have a very mature tree, you may want to consider planting several feet away from the trunk, and then allowing the plants that are rhizomatous or stoloniferous to slowly spread and fill in that area so that you don't damage the tree. And lastly, you don't want to build up or add soil to your soft landings plantings. The tree root system is the lungs of the tree. You'd be suffocating the tree. So, and also keeping debris, leaves, mulch away from the tree trunk to prevent bark rot. So just remember, you got to be thinking as like you're protecting the health of your tree when you're doing these soft landings plantings. So in summary, soft landings plantings can support these various life cycle stages of caterpillars, beneficial insects, native bees. You can help build healthy soil underneath your keystone tree, provide food for songbirds, the 96% of terrestrial songbirds that are looking for caterpillars to feed their offspring. You can potentially sequester more carbon than having just that compacted turf grass under your tree. And lastly, reduce time spent mowing, which we all would love to do. And you can tell your friends and neighbors about your soft landings planting, how it's a mini ecosystem and the purpose of it. So I think it's a really nice educational opportunity, both for a home garden or a planting within a park or a natural area. And Lori has included many of the links to these handouts that I have on this slide. So please check out those resources. We have plant lists. We have other information on keystone plants for various regions.